necesitas? Sí. Porque yo creo que conecto mi laptop. No. Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Buenos días. El ITESO, por medio del Comité Universitario de Protección Civil, les hace la siguiente indicación. En caso de necesitar desalojar el auditorio por cualquier circunstancia de riesgo, se les solicita que por favor lo hagan despacio, sin correr, sin gritar y sin empujar. Las salidas de emergencia se encuentran detrás de ustedes y a los costados. El punto de reunión se encuentra en el jardín posterior a este edificio. Se les solicita además tener especial cuidado con los niños y las personas con alguna discapacidad. Cualquier apoyo pueden acudir con el personal de seguridad del ITESO. Gracias. Sin más preámbulo, les doy la bienvenida a este tercer día de actividades del Encuentro de Innovación para el Desarrollo Sustentable. Y me permito presentar a Ula Jornbo, quien nos acompaña desde la Universidad de Waterloo. Tiene más de 8 años de experiencia en transformación de sistemas y el día de hoy nos va a hablar sobre la resiliencia como capacidad clave para la innovación. Les pido le demos la más cordial bienvenida. Bienvenida, Ula.
Good morning. I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much to our hosts for organizing this conference, for inviting me to speak to you today, and thank you all for joining me. It's very much a privilege, and so just thank you first. Yes, sorry. That's my sound check also. So yes, thank you for that introduction, Agustin. I'm Ola Schönbo. I'm from the University of Waterloo, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about social innovation and resilience. And I was reminded yesterday by our colleague David from Barcelona, who spoke about digital innovation, that when you say social innovation in different parts of the world to different people, people mean very different things by it. And the type of social innovation I'm going to be talking about today is the type of social innovation we're interested in at the University of Waterloo, where I'm from, in Canada. I'm from the Waterloo Institute of Social Innovation and Resilience. And the type of social innovation we look at is social innovation that transforms systems. So we're interested in innovations that change, modify the kind of underlying logics in our political, economic, cultural, and social systems. I'm going to say a little bit about what I mean by that in a few slides. But first, I want to say why I think social transformation is important. It's something we should be looking at. Hopefully my pointer is working. It is. Okay, good. So it really comes back to sustainable development. We have been talking yesterday and today a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals. I think one thing we can agree on when it comes to these goals that even though the goals are new, the problems that they talk about have been around for a long time. The international community has been dealing with many of these social issues for decades. And I think it's also fair to say that if we are honest with ourselves, the progress we have made in the last few decades is not that impressive. In some of these goals, we are making progress, yes. Some areas, it's not all bad, we are making progress. In other areas, almost no progress. In other areas, some progress, but not progress that's up to the scale of the problem. The scale of the problem is much more severe than the progress we're making. And more recently, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, negative progress. Particularly if you look at measures like democratization and some of these things. Respect for diversity. So, our perspective at Waterloo is that the reason we won't make progress on these problems unless we start talking about social transformation. That the only way for some of these problems, some of these issues, that we can tackle them is by looking at transforming our social systems. It is not enough to tackle the symptoms of these problems. We have to look at the root causes. And if we create social innovations that only look at the symptoms, not only will we not solve these problems, but we may actually do harm. That is our perspective at the University of Waterloo. And the reason is this. The reason is that some of these problems are produced by, they're products of the logics of our social systems. Climate change is created by our use of carbon fuels, well, fossil fuels. And that's fundamentally embedded in our economies. Similarly, we talked about sustainable agriculture. It was mentioned yesterday, recent reports, that one of the biggest changes we can make towards the sustainability of our planet is to switch the whole world over to a vegetarian diet. But that's not a simple thing to do. That's a profound social transformation. It's change. We're talking about changing our cultural relationship to food, our farming models. And what's more, there are powerful commercial interests who don't want the system to change. We're profiting from the system as it is, and they will oppose any efforts to transform that system. So social transformation is not easy, but at the same time it is necessary. It is absolutely necessary to create a truly sustainable world. And that's why at University of Waterloo, that's why we look at social transformation. When we look at this daunting task of how to turn the world vegetarian, how do you begin? How do you work towards that? That's something that we're trying to understand by looking at social innovation. So this is our definition of social innovation. It's not the only definition, and other types are good, but this one is ours. Thank you. So we say at Waterloo that a social innovation is any initiative, a product, a process, a program, a project, or a platform that challenges and over time contributes to changing the defining routines, resource and authority flows, or beliefs of the broader social system in which it is introduced. So really those fundamental underlying logics, the institutions that underpin our systems. And what's more, successful social innovations have durability, scale, and transformative impact. So you don't change culture for a couple of years and then you go back to the way things were. It's a change that lasts. Okay, so hopefully, I'm not going to spend any more time on trying to explain why we think social transformation is important. We can discuss it. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. So now, I'll go and say exactly what I mean when I talk about social transformation and what I think we've learned about it. So the Waterloo perspective on social transformation is influenced by two sets of theories that don't come from the social sciences. We're influenced by resilience theory and by complex adaptive systems theory, which are both theories that come partially out of ecology. The reason for that is partly historical accident. It's partly as a result of collaborations that happened between us, our researchers at Waterloo, and the Resilience Network, which is a global network, although we mainly collaborate with professors at the Stockholm Resilience Center. But it's also because within ecology, they started looking at systems transformation a few years ago, a couple of decades ago. And they learned some things about the way that complex adaptive systems behave that we think provided valuable insights into our understanding of social systems. That even though they were looking at natural systems and we were looking at systems with people in them, some of the patterns of how these types of complex systems behave are similar. And I hope to convince you of that. So let me talk a little bit about resilience theory. Is anyone familiar with resilience theory or complex adaptive systems theory? Okay, so here, yes? So a couple of people. Well, apologies to you because this will be a brief and therefore sketchy account, but anyway, moving on. So, but to the rest of you, so resilience theory, what is it? Essentially, resilience theory is a study of why ecological systems change, when and how they change. And it's really a study of when an ecological system transforms in a way to make it unrecognizable. And I have some examples here. First example is the coral reef. This is an example of what's called coral blanching or whitening. And it is a dead coral. Up to a certain point, coral reefs can absorb pollution, but they reach a certain tipping point, and they turn to look like this. They're no longer able to collect sunlight, and they die. And the system does not support life in the way that, it doesn't support a rich biodiversity of life in the way that we expect coral reefs to do. It's no longer recognizable as a coral reef. It's changed fundamentally its character. This is another system, a lake system. Again, clear lakes can absorb a certain amount of fertilizer pollution and still remain clear and productive. But after a certain tipping point, they will the fertilizer will promote such a growth of algae that it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, and it clogs up. And it comes to look like this, and it no longer supports the same species, the same fish species that it did before. Last example, this is desertification. So again, at some point, grasslands that have existed on the border of deserts, sometimes for centuries, start to lose their ability to support plant life and turn into deserts themselves. So why does this happen? Why do these systems suddenly change and become unrecognizable? That's what resilience looks at. A couple of technical definitions. Resilience refers to the amount of change a system can undergo and still retain the same controls on function and structure. Or, in more layman's language, the ability of systems to adapt and transform in the face of change without losing their desirable qualities. So, all systems are subject to pressure all the time, pressures of climate and human use or animal use. But most of the time, they are able to maintain their essential structures. So at what point do pressures become overwhelming and they change its character? That's what resilience scholars look at. Why did resilience scholars become interested in this? They became interested in this because of a couple of high-profile failures of managing ecosystems, basically in the 70s and 80s. And here are two examples of those. This example here refers to the collapse of the Northwest Atlantic cod fisheries. So today, there is essentially no Northwest Atlantic cod fishery. There's massive unemployment on the east coast of Canada and US due to lots of fishermen who used to have jobs no longer have it because there are no fish. This is a result of overfishing, of course, but we're familiar with that. But this was not uncontrolled overfishing. This was not overfishing when there was no scientific management of the resource. There was scientific management of the Northwest fisheries. And you can see that in the graph. So in the 60s, here you had the peak of the Northwest Atlantic fisheries, and there was rampant overfishing, leading to a collapse of the stocks. Here. But at that point, they introduced limits on catch, and they tried to manage the fisheries in a more scientifically sound way. And it looked like their efforts were working. The stocks seemed to go back up and stabilize. And then suddenly, after being stable for like a decade or a decade and a half, collapse. And it took the scientific community by surprise. They had been trying to manage the fishery by only looking at the population levels and the population dynamics of the cod. But in fact, there were complex interactions happening throughout the ecosystem that affected the cod levels that they were not measuring, to do with interactions between different species and levels of the cod predation on different species and the accessibility of food sources. And that led to this collapse because of complex ecosystem dynamics that they were not investigating, that they did not expect. Here's another example, a little bit less technical. Throughout the 70s and 80s, there was an effort to protect areas of wilderness and of nature by creating national parks all around the world. This was an international effort. And it was assumed by scientists, again, that if they could just get governments to commit to cordoning off an area of nature and saying, this is a park, we're going to preserve it, that they would have kept that ecosystem pristine. But of course, what actually happened is that these parks, they existed on paper, but in practice, there was no park. So here's an example of logging, illegal logging, in a park in Malaysia. And I read a study where they were saying that 80% of national parks, protected areas in Malaysia, are subject to illegal logging. And again, the mistake here was to try to manage the ecosystem in isolation, to not look at the complex interaction between the social system and the ecosystem, which actually was the determinant of the resilience of the system. So resilience scholars, they said, okay, we have to stop looking at systems from this top-down, very narrow perspective. We have to look at them in a whole systems way. We have to try and look at the whole complexity of interactions that actually determine the behavior and the outcomes of these systems. And this is an example of a heuristic that resilience scholars used to explore these kinds of ecosystem dynamics. This is called the adaptive cycle. And it's one of the early patterns that resilience scholars observed that governs the way that complex systems behave. The example I'm going to show you is to do with fires in forest systems. So what happens in forest systems is that over time, big, mature tree stands grow up, and they store a lot of energy and capital in large, mature trees. And these trees outcompete and dominate other species in the forest. The canopy becomes thick, and they take sunlight so the plants can't grow at the bottom. They suck up most of the water and nutrients from the soil, and other plants can't grow. But what happens after a while is that a fire comes into these systems, either through a lightning strike or through human-introduced fire, and the big trees burn. And human beings look at this and they say, okay, well, this is terrible. The forest is burning down. But that normally isn't what happens. What actually happens is, as the trees burn, they release the capital and energy that they have stored in them. They produce fertile ash, and they suddenly start allowing sunlight back down to the forest floor. And there are seeds in the earth that survive the fire and that make use of the sunlight and the resources that they have access to. And you suddenly get an explosion of new life. Lots of plants, lots of species grow back in the area that burned. And those species, they start to compete with each other for the same resources. They compete for soil nutrients, water, and sunlight. And some of them are successful and outcompete the others. And those that are successful, they grow up into a new set of mature forests. And this cycle continues. And as long as this cycle continues, the forest remains essentially healthy. It's resilient. It undergoes change and pressure, but it stays, essentially, it retains its essential character. It remains the forest that it is. Unfortunately, what we as human beings have often done when we've been presented with this type of ecosystem is we've suppressed the fires. We've tried to stop the fires from happening. And when we do that, more and more capital becomes stored in these large mature trees. And eventually a fire comes, despite our best efforts, because you can't suppress disturbances forever. And when that happens, if the forest is too big, if the trees are too mature, the fire burns hotter than it normally would, hot enough to kill the seeds in the soil. And you don't get to this stage. You don't get the renewal of new species. The seeds have been killed, and it can take much, much, much longer for the forest to recover. You get a barren landscape. So at Waterloo, we looked at this idea of the adaptive cycle, and we said, well, what can we learn from this? What does this tell us about the behavior of social systems? An important lesson, which is a standalone that I want everyone to be a message to take away from today, not all social innovation builds resilience or builds sustainability. The social innovation of suppressing fire, that did not build resilience. That actually hurt the forests. And now we've learned that, and in many areas we are reintroducing controlled fires into the way we manage forest ecosystems. And by the way, traditional methods of managing forests often included setting fires periodically. So we used to know this, but then we forgot. Not all innovations are the same way. If we only look at the symptoms, if we only look at, we don't understand the system's dynamics, we can do harm. Here's two examples. This is a picture of a dike in Holland, which is used to, I mean, most people probably know that Holland is a country that exists largely below the sea level. The only reason it exists as a country at all is because it has these systems of dikes that prevents the sea from essentially coming in and reclaiming the entire country. But that is a system of dikes that's persisted now for several centuries. It's essentially been a resilient, successful innovation. The Dutch have managed to live with flooding and sea level change for a long time. Let's see how they do when climate change hits, but hopefully they'll keep doing well. But then the other picture, this is a social innovation, I think, which we thought would build resilience, but we're not so sure now. This is a picture of fish farming, inland fish farming, which was really thought of really as a panacea for overfishing. We thought, okay, well, we can farm these fish, and if we do it inland, segregated from the natural oceans ecosystems where these fish live, then we should have minimal ecological impact. But in the recent studies that have come out about agricultural practice, inland fish farming has shown to be one of the least sustainable forms of agriculture that we have at the moment, one of the most carbon intensive. Not as bad as beef, but not good. So again, because we didn't consider the full complexities of what this type of fish farming entailed, we're not building resilience, we're undermining it. That's one lesson. Here's a slightly longer lesson. We looked at the adaptive cycle, and we thought, okay, is this a pattern that we see in social systems as well? Is this a pattern that can be applied to social innovation? Well, actually, I should go back a little bit. One of the things we noticed when we looked at the adaptive cycle is that it reminded us a little bit of some theories from social science, particularly Schumpeter, who talks about creative destruction in firms. So Schumpeter argued that sometimes firms that become too big, when they go bankrupt, they open up a space in the market and let new ideas and new entrepreneurs in. And that it's healthy for economic systems to undergo this process of creative destructions, to have big firms fail, to allow new ideas and new competitors in. So we thought, okay, maybe we can see this pattern of adaptive cycle, something similar in a social system. And we looked at a bunch of social innovations that were interesting to us, that we'd studied over time, and we thought that, yes, we do see a pattern that looks like this in our cases. So this is our social innovation cycle, which mimics the adaptive cycle. It's a little bit different. Let me just talk you through it. But I think what we see is that we have established social systems that are quite rigid, that resist change, where institutions have been around for a long time, and they change not at all or only gradually. But sometimes disturbances are introduced to those systems. They can be small disturbances, like a change in government, coming into a new electoral cycle, or they can be natural disasters or large disturbances, like countries going bankrupt or currencies losing their value. And when that happens, people start to look around for new ideas. They say, okay, well, we need new solutions to this problem. The way we've been doing things, it's not working. So then, just like in the ecosystems, we get an opportunity for people who have ideas, for new entrepreneurs to start saying, okay, this is what we should do. This is how we should tackle this problem. And some of those ideas start to attract supporters and allies and resources. And they go from being just a vision to, okay, this is how we would actually implement this. If we were going to try this idea out, this is what it would look like in practice. We develop it. The idea is developed. And then it's eventually launched in the marketplace or as a policy or however it's launched, depending on what kind of product it is. And at that point, it sinks or swims. Most new ideas don't do very well and don't survive for very long. A lot of new social enterprises die in the first 10 years. That's normal. That's what we expect. But a few become big, and they disseminate, and they spread both horizontally, so that means that competitors and similar types of ideas spread throughout the system, and they also start to change the institutions that they are inhabiting. So they become dominant. They become the new norm, and they eventually, sometimes, become a new established social system that resists change, and the cycle continues in this way. Let me give you a case example where we saw this kind of pattern happening. So one of the first cases I was ever involved in looking at was a forestry case that took place in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, where you have a type of forest that's known as, what's it called, Pacific temperate rainforest. It's a very productive type of forest, very rich in biodiversity, second only to kind of rainforest jungle. And most of this type of forest in the world exists only in northwestern North America, so Alaska and in British Columbia. Now, the status quo for this forest was that it was an important economic resource for the province. Most of the forest land was owned as crown land by the provincial government, and they leased this out to logging companies, and it was a real engine of the economy for a long time. In fact, a lot of Canada remains a primary resource extraction economy, and British Columbia was no exception. So that was the status quo. But there were a number of environmental organizations who thought that this was terrible, that this was a crime, that we were destroying this ecosystem probably forever, because we were talking about mature forests that would take hundreds of years to grow back. And so what they did was they started to protest against this logging that was happening. And at the same time, another interesting thing happened. Another disturbance came into the system, and that was that British Columbia, there are a lot of indigenous peoples in British Columbia, a lot of First Nations, as we call them in Canada, who had never signed treaties with the government to settle the status of their land claims. And they had been pursuing their land claims in court for a number of years, and then in the 90s, when this case occurred, the courts began to say that, yes, actually, some of these indigenous people do have rights to the land, and the government is going to have to start respecting those rights in the way that it handles land rights and land use. So in the face of both these big logging protests, and these were some of the biggest protests in Canada, these logging protests, there were people we had the largest mass arrest in Canadian history at the site of one of these logging protests, where protesters chained themselves to trees and they were dragged off by the police, and it was a big scandal. And so what the government did was they said, well, okay, we have to do something. We're going to open up a little bit of room in the system for new ideas. And they started a land use planning process. They've done this kind of process before. This was a stakeholder process where they invited different stakeholders in the room and said, we're going to come up with a land use plan that we're all going to sign off on, we're all going to agree on. These weren't new processes in British Columbia. They'd done them before. These processes were almost always dominated by the provincial government and the logging companies. They had the real say at these tables. So the First Nations and the NGOs, they didn't go. They boycotted the process. But they still saw it as an opportunity, and they said, well, we want to participate in this land use planning process, but we're only going to do so after we have found a way to be taken seriously, after our concerns will be listened to more carefully. And what they did then, quite cleverly, and I'll try to go a bit faster through this bit, what they did was they targeted the customers of the logging companies, which were largely large large European and American firms. They began to blockade stores in Europe and the US. So they said, we're not going to blockade forests anymore, we're going to blockade customers, which had an impact. A couple of large European chains canceled their contracts with logging companies in British Columbia. So the logging companies said, okay, maybe we're going to have to listen and we'll take the NGOs a bit seriously. They were seeing that their profitability was being threatened quite seriously. There were other reasons for that, but but the combination of the land use, the claims from the indigenous peoples and these blockades, the NGOs, were an actual threat to their business model. And they thought, okay, we are probably going to have to change if we're going to keep operating in here. So what happened is the ENGOs and the logging companies started negotiating with each other. And the ENGOs at this point did something very intelligent, I think, which was to say, look, really what we'd like to see is an end to all logging in British Columbia. We think that any logging is destructive and a threat to our ecosystems, but we're going to compromise. We're going to recognize that it's such an important part of our economy. It's so vital to all the local communities along the coast that there has to be some logging. So we're going to find our way to compromise and agree on what this logging should look like. And they basically agreed that there needed to be ecosystem-based management principles that determined how logging was done. So they weren't going to take clear cut. The general practice had been clear cutting and just taking all the trees in an area. They were going to stop that. They were going to use selective cutting. They were going to leave wildlife corridors, and there were certain areas that they weren't going to touch at all. So they came up with a sound, scientific, ecosystem-based plan. And then, once they developed that plan, they reached out to the First Nations, to the indigenous people, and they said, we want you to support this plan. We think it benefits you. We think it's in accordance, by the way, with some of your principles, your traditional principles of how these forests should be managed. And we think that this will give you a better say about what's done in the land. And so that happened. They agreed. So the First Nations, the environmental NGOs, and the logging industry all came back to the land use planning table as a coalition. And they said, look, this is the plan we think we should all agree on. And because they had enough momentum at that point, the government couldn't really say no. These were the biggest stakeholder groups, and they were agreeing. So the government really had no choice. So they signed off, and provincial legislation was passed to make this land use plan a reality. And so it was launched. And then that's when there was a huge amount of negotiation taking place about how this ecosystem-based management approach was going to be implemented. And essentially what happened was that government said, look, they went to the indigenous people and they said, we will deal with you directly. We don't want to deal with the environmental organizations. We will negotiate with you in a bilateral government-to-government way. And the First Nations went with it. So there was competition here between the actors, between the ideas, and the ENGOs were pushed out. And when I first did the case, that was where I left it. And it looked quite promising still. It looked like this ecosystem-based plan was going to be applied, and we would essentially have maybe saved the temperate rainforest. The reality now, almost 10 years later, is that the plan is in place, but the implementation of it is it's essentially a paper park. So the implementation is nothing like what it was supposed to be, and there has to be a new round of innovation now to try and actually get people to do what they said they would do. But still, we saw this kind of cycle. And we saw that social innovation is not a process with an end goal. It's a process where you need to be constantly working. As soon as you think you've achieved what you want, the ground will change around you. You'll start to see unanticipated consequences, undesirable consequences of the innovation that you produced, and then you will have to start thinking again about the next innovation. It never stops. What we wanted to do, though, so having sort of said, okay, we can learn from resilience theory and complex adaptive systems theory about how social systems behave. And what we want to do is we want to start looking for patterns in the way that social innovations happen. So what are the patterns? Are there things that we can learn about how social innovations happen that will make us better at social innovation, that will make us better able to transform systems, so that we will have an idea about how to turn the whole world vegetarian? One of the first things we looked at was, what was the role of agency in cases like the Great Barrier Reef Forest? So the ecologists, where we got the adaptive cycle from, they're not social scientists, they basically hadn't looked at people at all. And we thought, okay, we're social scientists, we'll look at the people, we'll see what are the agents doing in this system. So one of the first things to do is, okay, who were the people involved in making this Great Barrier Rainforest happen, and what were they doing? These are some of them. This is an environmental leader, a First Nations leader, and one of the logging company representatives. That's Linda Cody, Art Sterrett, and I forget. What's your name? She has, Sephora Berman. So one of the first things we realized was that there was leadership at work in the Great Barrier Rainforest, but it wasn't one person. That there were a number of people associated with driving this social innovation forward, and that they were active at different points in the process, and they were using different skills and different capacities at different points in the process. So early on, one of the things that needed to happen was that the NGOs had to find some way to actually get influence, to introduce a disturbance big enough into the system that they would get influence in the negotiation process. So someone had to come up with the market strategy, the strategy of attacking the logging companies' markets, and that was Sephora Berman, largely. There's a type of strategic thinking, an ability to see connections between different scales of a system, different parts of the system, and to see where there might be opportunities for leverage, to introduce disturbances into a system. And that's the type of skill you need in the conservation phase. In the sense-making phase, what needed to happen was that the logging companies and the environmental NGOs who had been bitter enemies, these were people who had stood on opposite sides of a blockade. Some of them had been chaining themselves to trees, and others had been dragging them away to to prison. They hated each other, really, frankly speaking. But that's no way to negotiate. So you needed people at the negotiating table who were able to say, okay, we need to come up with a shared vision. And that starts, in this case, with recognizing our mutual humanity. And one of the things they recognized was, well, actually, a lot of the environmental leaders and the logging leaders, we all live in the same neighborhood in Vancouver. And we take our kids to the same parks. And so there is a lot of common ground for us to work with. So let's start there. And they had a strategy they called the love strategy, actually to try and humanize their opponents and say, that's how we need to be able to negotiate. So you need people who are able to do that kind of sense-making, that shared collective vision building. Then, as you got to, okay, we want to do an ecosystem-based management approach, what's that going to look like? Well, then you need people with entrepreneurial skills who can say, okay, someone who can actually develop an idea that's just a vision, that is pretty named, like the love strategy, into an actual concrete implementable plan. And there were a number of hard-nosed people who have been developed this ecosystem-based management approach over a number of years, and they recognized that they would find application here. So that was kind of an entrepreneurial set of skills. And then finally, in the selling phase, so we call that brokering, because it's, at that stage, it's often you need to broker partnerships, and you need to bring ideas together into what we call a bricolage, into a coherent alternative. And then there are the selling skills. So once you're out in the market, you're actually implementing it, you have to find your audience. And the government was very clever, The government was very clever here because they realized that they could sell their vision to the First Nations by promising this government-to-government negotiation, by recognizing their authority, they could push the NGOs out of the equation. So there are selling skills, marshalling resources, attracting allies, attracting new support. And then you get back up here, where you essentially, you don't need innovation anymore. You need people who can run the ship in a steady way, who can make sure that things are working correctly, and then a few people thinking, okay, that's fine, but what's the next cycle? How can we start the next cycle? So we said, okay, these are some of the skills we need, some types of leadership we need to make social innovation happen. But what else is there? What other patterns are there in social innovations that we can learn from that will help us to become better at this kinds of systems transformation? So that's kind of brings us up to the most recent work we've been doing at the University of Waterloo, where we're inspired by a group of scholars in Holland who are called the Socio-Technical Transitions Network. And they've done similar work to this, but they've looked at technical innovation. They've looked at the way that technical innovations enter social systems and sometimes transform them, transform the infrastructure, transform the way that we do business. And they've managed to identify a number of patterns in the way that this happened. And we thought, okay, hopefully we can do something similar, but for social innovations. So what we did was we looked at, I think it was 10 originally, cases of historical social innovation. And said, what we're going to do is we're going to track these innovations through their whole life cycle and look at what patterns do we see in the way that these things are happening. So we took ideas, we tried to identify the point when a new social innovation was born. What was the idea that first gave rise to this innovation? And we'll track it all the way through until it's become established. So we picked 10 cases of what we thought were significant social innovations where we could pinpoint the original conception of the innovation and track it right through to the institutionalization. And we started to look for patterns across those cases. And that's what we do in this book. So we did find some patterns. I'm going to talk about just a few of those. So one of the first patterns that we think you see in social innovation is the idea of what we call shadow networks. Does anyone know what this equation is? No. I don't know either. Well, I do now, but no, I'll come to it in a second. So one of the first innovations that we looked at, systems-changing innovations, was the derivatives market, the modern financial derivatives market. We said this was something that fundamentally changed our economies, for good and for bad, mostly bad these days. But how did this come about? And one of the things we saw was the idea of a financial market that was governed by markets and not by the state had been around a long time. It really traces its origins to before the First World War. And there was a group of academics, mostly based out of Vienna, some of them who had fled, who were activists against communism, who were called the Mont Pelerin Society. And they had been advocating for this market-based approach to managing our economies for a long time. They started advocating for this approach way before the Second World War. And they were trying to convince governments to implement this kind of market-based economic management. But they weren't given a lot of hearing. People weren't receptive to their ideas. And especially in the immediate post-World War II period, that was a period of Keynesianism, of real government-managed economies. The Mont Pelerin Society was never successful in getting their ideas into public policy. But then, in the 60s, they got their moment. You had the Nixon shocks, the US leaving the gold standard, and suddenly there was an intellectual climate in America, and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, that was turning against government-managed economy towards market-based managed economy. And at the same time, a number of technical innovations were happening. Computing was starting to come around. And three economists, in fact, Black, Scholes, and Merton, came up with this equation, the Black-Scholes-Merton equation, which was a way, okay, I'm getting way out of my comfort zone now, a way essentially of predicting or tracking the movement of the future price of stocks. So because of this equation, because of the rise of computing powers, they opened up this market in financial derivatives. Futures trading had always existed in a sense. It started essentially in agriculture, with farmers selling their crops at a price before they had ever harvested it. It was a way of ensuring that they would have an income in the following year. But they took this idea of selling a product before it existed and basically gambling on the future price, the future value of products, and they made it a cornerstone of our economy. So there was a trigger. This equation and the computing was the trigger for the innovation, but it would not have happened without the Mont Pelerin Society. It would not have happened if there hadn't been a shadow network that was working alongside the dominant paradigm, alongside the government-managed economies, and advocating for this different approach for decades before the opportunity arose in the 1960s. And we saw this in all our cases. In all our cases, there were networks of people who were advocating for an alternative to the established system for decades before the innovation was ever launched. And we said, so you need these shadow networks. You want to launch a new idea, it can't come out of nowhere. It has to have been developed and supported. Here was another pattern that we saw, which we call prophetic starting conditions. Sorry about the text. One of the things that we saw was that the values and the ideas that are contained in innovation when it's first launched continue to play a very powerful role in the way that innovation evolves over time. This was something we saw in the development of the World Wide Web and the internet most clearly. So the trigger, essentially, for the internet, for the World Wide Web, was a new technology called packet switching, which I won't go into, but essentially is a transformation in the way we send information, which made the World Wide Web possible. But the people who were interested in computing and the idea, the World Wide Web, the internet, was developed, I'm sure that some of you know, by the Department of Defense in the US, an organization called DARPA. But the people who worked at that department, even though it was a military department, and even though they were involved in something quite technical, like computing, a lot of them were also products of the 60s. They were products of the kind of intellectual tradition of the 60s, and they had a quasi-utopian vision for what this new internet, this new technology was going to bring. They fundamentally believed in the values of freedom of access to information. They thought that this was going to change the world. This was going to open knowledge up to everyone. And that was a set of values that they clung to firmly. So as the internet began to develop and people began to recognize the potential of this technology, what happened was that a number of large telecommunications companies in US and Europe tried to take control of it. They tried to use patented technologies that they had come up with to say that this was going to be the basis of the internet. But the people who were involved in developing this idea resisted that because it didn't fit with their vision of what the internet should be. And throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, access to this technology was essentially open to anyone. Anyone could join their network to the internet network. There were no proprietary protocols. It was free-for-all, because of these values. So when Tim Berners-Lee, what he did was introduce the World Wide Web, which was really a user interface system for the internet, a way to make the internet accessible to everyone. It had previously been the domain of specialists, universities, and research institutes, and it needed packaging that meant that everyone could use it. And that he was not the only one to develop this type of packaging. There were a lot of different competing web browsers or versions of looking at the internet when he created the World Wide Web. But his version was successful because it fitted with the principles. He released his version free to everyone. The other versions were all proprietary. They were owned by universities or by private institutes. And so the internet community didn't want to use them. They wanted to use the free one, the one that anyone could use and develop for. And that was a large part about why the World Wide Web became successful, why the internet, in its early years at least, has remained this place where anyone has access to information equally. Anyone can upload whatever web service they want. Telecommunications companies are still trying to change that by ending net neutrality and these sorts of things. But the starting conditions, the initial ideas, the initial values that were embedded in the internet have still shaped the way it's developed. And this, again, we saw in all our cases. Two more. Another pattern that we saw was this notion of embedded contradictions. And we saw this most clearly in the national parks example in our book. So when a new innovation is launched, it often involves compromises between different stakeholder groups, different competing interests. Just like we saw in the Great Barrier Rainforest, that they needed to find a compromise between logging and protecting the resource, social innovations often include these types of compromises. The US national park system was born out of a set of compromises like this. So there was a movement in the US and in Europe of essentially people with a sense of romantic naturalism who wanted to protect our natural areas, to keep them pristine. And they were lobbying for the creation of parks. But they weren't really paid attention to and listened to. They were successful for a number of reasons, but one of them was that the railway companies that were building railways across North America, they wanted to give people a reason to use those railways. They wanted people to say, okay, why should people get on a train and travel hundreds of miles across Canada and the US? Why should they use these new networks that we created, other than transporting goods? And they thought, well, tourism. If we create these national parks and we advertise them as great, pristine treasures, people will go there, which is why a lot of national parks in the US and Canada had these huge railway hotels embedded in them, because it was this combination of commercial interests and ideological interests that gave rise to national parks. But those two values are in tension. Rampant tourism isn't good for the ecosystem. So that uneasy contradiction continues to be embedded in the innovation of the national park. And at some point, I'm sure it will become the next thing that we have to change, the next innovation that we have to tackle. So this, and again, we saw embedded contradictions in all our cases. In the internet, it was the contradiction between the telecommunication companies who own the infrastructure and the open access information ideology. And that, too, has become the next battleground. So we saw that these embedded contradictions, they can tell us, perhaps, when we launch a social innovation, what is the next set of problems likely to be? Okay, that's all of them. So, what do we take from all this? Well, it's a few, I think, ideas, some takeaway messages. first off, I should say this work is still in a very early stage, as you can probably tell. We're still looking at social innovations. We're still trying to understand the patterns. But we do think we can start to make some recommendations to people who are interested in social innovation about how it should be done well. How do we do social systems transformation? These are the takeaways. Not all innovation builds resilience, builds sustainability. How can we promote the success of innovations that do over those that don't? That's the first point. The second point, social innovations don't come out of nowhere. There is social innovation happening in all over the world, in all our countries. There are innovative people and organizations that are pursuing ideas. We need to find the shadow networks that already exist and empower them. And I think one of the most promising ways that we can empower shadow networks is by introducing them to each other. When we have lots of people in a country that are working on a similar set of ideas and values, form them into a network so that they can become self-sustaining. Even if there's not an opportunity right now for them to launch their idea, if they become a network, they can hopefully sustain interest over time, over the decades, until there is an opportunity. Not all social innovations can succeed at all times. We must look for innovations that have affinity with the systems we are trying to change. So we would not be able to introduce anything that looks like communism in the US. It's just anathema, cultural anathema. So what are the things that we could introduce? What are things that, even though they're different from the kind of neoliberal orthodoxy that's prevailed, it's similar, has some affinity with kind of the profound cultural values in that country that you could introduce that type of innovation? Starting conditions are very important. We need to embed our core values at the earliest phases of our innovation. So you can compromise, you have to compromise at the beginning of an innovation, but don't let go of the core values. If they're not part of your prophetic starting conditions, then you will lose them. And then social innovations create embedded contradictions, and these can help us to anticipate the next problems that we will need to solve. So I think I still have 10 minutes, so we have some time for questions. And that's it.
So my name is Liviera John. I just wanted to find out if you could explain a little bit more on the graph, the area of connectedness, please. How is that being addressed?
Sorry, you mean?
Yeah, this area down here in connectedness. Could you?
Right. Yes, so those two lines, everyone asks about those. They're sort of, they're remnants of but we still use them. They're remnants of the origins of this in ecosystems. So one of the things that happens is that the potential is really how much of the energy is being stored and not utilized. So in a mature forest, most of the capital, most of the energy in the forest is stored in mature trees. It's not being used. It's potential energy. It's not active energy. And that's also true, more or less, in the reorganization phase. Well, what happens in the reorganization phase? In the release phase, all the energy is released, so potential energy is low. And as plants start to exploit that energy, more and more of it becomes stored as potential energy. So that's why the potential. Connectedness, this also seems to be true in ecosystems and a little bit in social systems, is that the more mature a system, the denser the interactions between the different components of that system, the more closely connected it is. The more interactions between species, between plants, the more dependencies there are within the systems, the more connections. And we think that there's a little bit similar things we see in social systems, even though we're not talking about energy. The connectedness is more or less the same. We think that in mature systems, as systems become more mature, we'll start to see denser and denser social networks. There'll be nodes that are off on their own, that are shadow networks that aren't very well connected, but the core parts of the systems will be densely interconnected. And that makes it hard to change. It makes it more inflexible. Potential, when we talk about potential, we're really talking about the density of institutions. So in mature systems, there are institutions that cover more and more areas, aspects of our behavior. So there are regulations, laws, and routines for most of the situations that we come across. But in open systems, we lack institutions, and there's more potential to add those. So potential is not probably the right word anymore, but we still keep these words in because we haven't come up with better ones, essentially.
Okay. One more question. Oh, can I have one more question? Oh, thanks. So on the very last slide you have,
yes,
I totally agree with you on about the values. It comes down to oh, it doesn't go. So you discussed how, we must embed our core values at the earliest phases of our innovation.
Yes.
So for me, that tells us of the great importance it puts on our personal beliefs, opinions, and everything that comes down to decision making, how we come together, how we are acting.
Yes.
Are there any systems already that are focused on those in the system you are speaking about?
How do you mean by systems that focus on?
Yeah, I mean, are there, so I know that there are environmental organizations, but are there any ways that are coming together looking at that factor more closely?
You know, not that
as part of...
Not that I'm aware of. When we see this sort of championing of core values, where we most see it is in agents and individuals who, it's a difference in approach that you see in different organizations and different individuals. Some individuals and organizations are very pragmatic. They have a certain set of ideas that they want to get across, and they're prepared to compromise on their principles. One of the examples of this that I'm very sad about, actually, is the Liberal Democratic Party in the United Kingdom. For years, one of their biggest changes that they wanted to introduce was a change to the electoral system. They essentially had become almost a single-issue party, that they cared about electoral reform, partly because the system that England had was artificially reducing the number of seats that they had based on their vote share. So when there was a hung election in England a number of years ago, the Liberals had the balance of power, and they could have formed the government with either Labour or the Conservatives. And ultimately what happened was that even though they had much more ideological overlap with Labour, and that their supporters were much more likely to be sympathetic to Labour than Conservatives, they, for pragmatic reasons, decided that they would form an alliance with Conservatives and use that to try and get their first part, this voting change in. The voting change never happened, and they completely lost the basis of their support. That decision to kind of go back on their core values proved completely disastrous for them in the end. So I don't know if there are organizations that are watchdogs of kind of sticking to your core values, but I do know that there are organizations that keep that as part of their strategy and those that don't. And I would advise that people be careful about compromising their core values.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much, Ola, for the presentation. It was really inspiring and interesting, and learned quite a few things, so that's always good. But there was some examples that you made that were not a waking call, we would say, but they were, they were translated into real insights, particularly the examples of failed social innovations, like the one that you mentioned on inland
yes.
farming, fish farming. What would be your suggestion for people like myself and many other researchers here who do research on collecting cases of what we honestly think are good endeavors or projects that address social needs that they have, that they meet some criteria, but indeed, in many cases, as you said, they only address the surface of the problem. The issue, my problem is that if I look at what you presented here, if you need to go to the root causes, I only see as a solution or as a social innovation, perhaps the Soviet Revolution or something like this. So it should be a dramatic change, what would be a perfect example of social innovation. There are not that many well-rounded examples like the World Wide Web, etc. So this is a question that I have always had. I mean, I'm simply alleviating the symptoms of a failed system that we can easily identify. How would you address this? That would be my question.
Okay, I have some suggestions, but they are only suggestions. This is a real problem. Complex adaptive systems are unpredictable. We can never be sure that the innovation we introduce is a good one. A lot of, an example, I was going to use another example, but I didn't because it's too politically sensitive, but so now I'm doing it anyway, against my better judgment. So one of the failed examples of social innovations we use in the book is something called the residential schools in Canada. I don't know if there are any Canadians here who are familiar with residential schools. Even calling them a social innovation, it could get me in a lot of trouble in those circles. But essentially, the residential schools was an attempt to integrate the indigenous population of Canada into mainstream society. And the way they did this was by taking children away from their families and their communities and bringing them up with a Western-style education. Most of the educating was done by religious organizations. There were horrendous abuses perpetuated in those schools, physical and otherwise. But what also they failed to consider was not only that these young children would be the victims of this kind of predation, but also that by removing them from their communities, they stripped them of all the cultural and social strategies and skills and resilience that they had. And when they went back to their communities, well, it was a disastrous. I mean, the consequences in suicide rates, alcoholism rates, unemployment are a scandal, a horrible scandal for Canada. I would argue, though, that not everyone involved in the residential school system they didn't go into it thinking that they were going to commit cultural genocide. That's what they did, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was actually, we want to improve, for some, not everyone, but for some of the people who created the system, the intention was that we want to improve the quality of life for these people. We think that the best way to do that is to give them access to the same education systems that we have. It didn't work. There's always a risk in social innovation. When you talk about social transformation, that the consequences will be disastrous. One of the ways you can, what are some of the strategies that you can use to help avoid that? One is to start small, to try things out on a small scale, experiment, and try it in practice before you launch into a big social change. Another strategy is to do a systems analysis. We would always recommend, when you look at a social innovation, do take the time to look at what are the kind of different drivers, the different dynamics involved here. If you're introducing something that seems like, take another example, like Uber, which seems like a pretty simple introduction, okay, it's a way for people to use their cars to make some money and to help each other, it's a suggestion for transport. It's only later that we come to realize, well, this has profound implications for, the way our whole employment system, the way we think about protecting employee rights. But that's not completely unpredictable. We could have maybe predicted, if we'd done an analysis, thought, well, actually, these are some of the systems that this innovation will affect, and these are some of the likely consequences. So there is an element of unpredictability, but there is also an element of, if we do an analysis, we can have some insight into maybe what are some of the precautionary measures we can put in to protect against some of the unwanted consequences. And because we know it's unpredictable, how can we try it at a small scale to see what we hadn't thought about before we tried it at a large scale? That's it. Not foolproof, but.
Hi. You kind of answered part of my question already. Thank you. We're with a group that we help and we promote social change through change of habits, through creating consciousness, through creating awareness. My question was that, with the same question that you had, you all kind of had questions related. With the chart, with connectivity, obviously that's what we want, more connections between people so that they can see the results and consequences of things happening, right? But then with the potential, I was confused if that potential is the potential for the environment, the potential for change, the potential within people. Then you said something about the durability in institutions. So just to clarify, and also if you could clarify that part for me. And then the question linked to that is, in all of the studies that you guys are following throughout the whole cycle from the beginning to the end, do you also take into consideration the resiliency of the people, not just of the project itself, but of the people who are adapting to it? Because the resiliency, I mean, the way I see it, every institution, everything in life is made up of people. And normally we focus on the project, we focus on the mission, we focus on the intention, but we don't focus on how it impacts the individual people involved. So do you guys also factor that into your research?
Yes. Okay, I have a couple of, thank you for the question, because it raises a couple of interesting things. On the networks, I would say that connectivity is good, and for some things, it's not good for other things. If you have a densely connected social network, what you create is a lot of social capital and solidarity, but you make it hard for new ideas to come in from the outside. So this is that old thing about social capital, about bridging capital versus bonded capital. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but there are types of, if you get a really dense social network, it's very cohesive, but it tends to not allow for much room for change or growth. People are very attached to their way of life, and particularly when everyone around them is living in the same way. It becomes a mutually reinforcing system. So while that's good most of the time, sometimes we need to change. And sometimes it can be bad to have a very densely connected network. And what we need is actually a network that has lots of connections outside itself, so it allows room for new ideas. That's one thing. So there's no straightforward way to talk about networks and what kind of network you want. That's the first comment. To clarify on the potential point, so really potential is the wrong word, and that's clear. And we haven't, this still remains a quite underdeveloped part of the theory, but the connection we've made is between the work is a researcher called Silvia Dorado, who looks at the institutional landscape and how open that is to innovation. And her hypothesis is that in areas of social life, of public life, where you have a lot of institutions, so laws and routines and customs that govern the way we behave, our conduct, again, there's very little room to try something new. You know, like if you walk into a diplomatic meeting and behave outside of protocol, then you'll be ejected. There are other areas of social life where there is more room for divergence. So you can go to a music festival and no one will care if you run around naked and smeared in mud. And that can be quite good. So the fewer institutions there are governing our behavior, the more room we have to introduce new ways of behaving, and vice versa. So that's to try to clarify that. In terms of consequences for the people, so whenever you look at systems, the first problem that you tend to confront is how you draw your boundaries, because every system is in fact made up of multiple systems. We as human beings, we're a system. We're a self-regulating system that maintains a temperature, an input and output of nutrients and so forth. So every individual is in fact a system. And a city is a system, a country is a system, a community is a system. So where do you draw your boundaries? There's always a problem that we run into. And the truth is that the consequences of a social innovation will be different for different parts of the system, always. There are always winners and losers. So even in the Great Bear Rainforest case, that it was one of my favorite examples of successful innovation until it wasn't. That even in that case, the logging companies were much less profitable when the other end of that innovation than at the beginning. And the people who worked for them, many of them did lose their jobs. Now you can argue that they were going to anyway. But for them, that social innovation didn't build their resilience. So it's always there. Unfortunately, power is a real thing and winners and losers are a real thing. We want to say that this is not a zero-sum game, that by collaborating, by working together, we can create a bigger pie. But the way we divide it up will always create some division. Probably necessary. It's probably good to reshare the pie sometimes. That's that.
Well, thank you, Ula. In the name of ITESO, we want to thank you for your presentation and extend you this gift.
Yeah, thank you.